pleasure to be here. It's a little intimidating to be placed between these two outstanding veterinarians that are on the program in this session also. I'm a reproductive physiologist, but I'm going to try to talk to you about an issue that I think is pretty important to the whole production scheme, and it's going to be an issue that I think is going to be a real driver in the future as to where we're going to have to go with a lot of our research concerning nutrition. We take a look at the objectives of the talk. What I want to do is define lameness and describe changes with the inflammatory response. What happens to this animal's body when we get an inflammatory stimulation? And then what these pathways, how lameness may actually impact reproductive performance. Thanks, I just got used to it. It's flipped backwards. The computer doesn't take it though the way that it normally does. Now, the one thing I want to make sure of, I'm not a veterinarian. I'm not an immunologist. We can go through all kinds of different things. I understand most of these. They get very, very complicated. If you look at some of the new models that are put out in Science magazine, Nature magazine, we have a lot of these pathways that have as many as several hundred directions and things that they actually impact and go against. I'm not going to talk about very much of this. What I want to talk about is look at the things. How does the stimulation of the release of cytokines, an inflammatory response, actually impact what we call lameness? This is a definition I'm stealing from my cohorts, Dr. John Dean and Anil, with looking at the definition of lameness. I want to talk about aberrant behavior, and particularly the issue of gait, willingness to walk, willingness to stand, and the most important issue for me is if it's painful. What we find is we get into lameness where we don't find the issue of pain. We find very little response as to the impacts that it actually has on production. If we take a look, lameness, it can be inflammatory. The last set of sows that we took from the packing plant, we actually went in, scored the sows, took lame sows, took them the front legs and rear legs off of each of these animals, looked at the lesion scores, and if you notice, several of these lesions are quite severe, and then actually had our pathologist cut these open, take a look, and actually see how much inflammation or infection did we actually have. On this grouping, we took 100 sows. Over 90% of them showed pathology that showed us an infection or inflammatory type response. Now, we can't predict that totally from the field. There's a lot of times you can go and look at a claw lesion. You might think it's quite severe, and the sow walks away quite normally. Her production is quite normal, and we don't see much of a change. So not all of these are always going to be inflammatory. We take a look at these. These have a pretty high probability, especially this one. We look at how severe it misshapen the foot and how much infection is actually swollen up in that. Not all lesions may create an inflammatory response. Here's an issue of sows that probably don't walk quite as well, but we don't see very much of a parameter that it actually changed our production profile on these sows. This is a group of sows that we're working on a project trying to understand what created this response of the long toe problem. We look at the effects of lameness, a paper published from University of Minnesota, and look at the issue when they compared not lame and lame sows on pigs born per day per sow. What we find is that the not lame sows are almost twice as productive. Almost more compelling to me is the issue, if you take a look at the p-value, we have very few items that we'll run into that is predictive of a production problem related to this, and so that its impact on production is highly, highly significant with the correlation. We also see the issue of survival and total herd number of days in the herd were decreased for the lame sows versus our not lame sows. Cytokine-mediated reprogramming of metabolism. Right? We get a release of cytokines. We got an inflammatory response. Let's say we pick the lame sow that is really hurting, walking in trouble. We can ensure that that animal more than likely is changing the nutrient supply, trying to make sure that it's supplying the immune system for the development of the leukocytes, development of the macrophages, and our process of making antigens, or response to the antigens, our antibodies, and our issue to actually the liver's response to make acute phase proteins. So all of these nutrients are shifted for this. Very few organs in the body are exempt once we get a cascade of the cytokines released, that we aren't going to see some alteration of nutrient metabolism. Altered nutrient uptake, we may see a decrease in uptake. We may actually see, if we get a fever, that the sow doesn't want to eat as much. Anabolic processes are interrupted. We'll show you some data on this in a second. Companion catabolic activities are amplified. So not only is it making the animal not utilize proteins as well for production and for muscle development, but we are actually catabolically breaking those back down, trying to help supply these nutrient needs for the immune system. Skeletal muscle is depleted of several essential and non-essential amino acids after a single injection of TNF-alpha, leads to reduced performance. So all these give us that impact. Now, if we look at it, and I put it in a little more simple aspect or diagram, if we look at an immune response, whether it's coming from endotoxins, coming from pathogens, trauma, and severe trauma that's occurring chronically, we get into tissue damage and get activation, which activates our macrophages. The macrophages stimulate the release of cytokines. Cytokines then change muscle metabolism towards the direction of catabolism. Leukocytes become activated. Bone marrow, leukophoresis. Our hypothalamus, fever and anorexia, acute phase proteins, all of these pathways can get stimulated. Now, outside of that, the cytokines also do a vast number of regulations of metabolic processes at the exact same time. Right? Among the most important cytokines, the inflammatory cytokines, interleukins, IL-1, IL-2, IL-6, you'll find in the literature most often, they have a vast, much greater number of these interleukins today. Tumor necrosis factor alpha, interferon gamma are some of our most important inflammatory respondents. Intrinsic anti-inflammatory cytokines, IL-1 receptor antagonist, transforming growth factor beta, and soluble TNF receptor. Now, these are important. What this does is, depending how acute the response is, or how chronic and how long the response is gone, these help back regulate and cut down on the inflammatory response. And so that they'll take those systems back and forth. If we take a look quickly and just look at a few of these production parameters, and why I want to put some of these up here is to try to get you to start thinking about how does this stuff impact sows. This is work done by Noel Williams back in 1995, they reported. And this was just showing you what happens if we immune activate and look at different lysine regimens for animals that are low or high immune activation. We get a very big difference in how those animals perform and grow. If we look at an inflammatory response from mastitic cows, if we take a look at, even if it's chronic mastitis, not where it's showing up as real bad, but it's just continuous, We get into that we get reduced levels of estradiol, decreased timing of ovulation, or increases our timing of ovulation, reduced follicular steroidogenesis, lower oocyte competence, reduced messenger RNA expression for our LH receptors. And this is data that was just recently reported at the National Animal Science meetings looking at this impact of chronic mastitis. Another one. This one I think is quite critical. Cumulative subclinical disease or stressors can cause significant alterations in metabolism. If we take things like temperature, stocking density, and regrouping, we can cause a change in growth rate, decreasing it by 10%, 16%, and 11% for the three items listed above. When we put all three of those stressors together, what we find was that the decrease in growth rate was 31%. They're synergistic, they add. The more stressors you give an animal, the more they accumulate. And the greater your problem is going to be. If we take a look at the sow, we know the issue of low voluntary feed intake. If we get that, we get into all kinds of production failures with the sow. Dr. George Foxcroft did a really nice job looking at the metabolic pathways and the hormone pathways that actually impact when we are low in proteins, low in carbohydrates in particular, and we get impacts on GnRH, LH and FSH, and steroids. What is interesting is we're finding a tighter and tighter relationship with misfeeding events, mild starvation, and even severe starvation looks just like the worst inflammatory disease you can give an animal. So when we look at those pathways and think about we can now get these hormone impacts just off of that sow reducing her feed intake, we then want to look at the issue of nutrient partitioning. We already know the cytokines have quite a bit of control on this, and they're going to try to change the order of what gets partitioned. If we take a look, the normal animal, and if things are running smoothly, has to fulfill body maintenance. They then fulfill lactation, growth, and one of the lowest ones on the list is actually reproduction. With this, what you'll see is that if first and second parity animals give us more problems with lactation, feed consumption, we actually run into a lot more problems with reproduction in those early parity sows because they've got to do a fair bit with providing for growth. If we bring in immune activation now we change this cascade and a lot of things start to happen. We have to bring in a lot more branch chain amino acids that get utilized for nutrient, for energy, because now glucose and insulin sensitivity changes very dramatically due to the cytokines. We change, the needs are moving towards this system and will deplete from these systems. What is interesting, even in reproduction, if we get the release of cytokines, we start seeing shutdown of a lot of things with reproductive performance, particularly in the male, is the easiest model to look at. When we get the male also, and both the female and the male have the propensity that even besides the cytokine release that's through the blood system, they have it internally within the Leydig cells that they will release due to sensing those will also release then cytokines to help shut down that system. We'll show you that a little bit more in just a second. Now, the response to stressors or inflammation. And when I think about this for a second, we've got several things here. We've got feeding, we've got water deprivation. All of these are things that can cause us stressors that actually can release systems to the brain that signal that sets up this thing with getting this. So if we have a monocyte that detects and we've got an inflammatory response, we get the release of any of the cytokines. It is a positive stimulus to the hypothalamus to release corticotropic releasing hormone, vasopressin, which then releases ACTH. All right? That pathway then is also some of the other things that get released start changing also feed intake, start changing pathways as to where the nutrients are also going to be sorted to and to which organs and systems of the body are going to need this. Epinephrine released from the adrenal glands will actually help stimulate both the corticotropic releasing hormone and vasopressin. They tend to be synergistic. So our flight or fight hormone, we also add to this a stressor. Think about the model, Dr. Paul Hamsworth in Australia. I never locked into this till I started working on this project, but he showed in 1995 that if he just trained employees on how to handle sows, and he used 10 farms of each, they had them paired, they took these farms, trained half of them how to handle sows, the other half they didn't. When they did that, he got a 6% change in reproductive performance for taking care of the issue of how to handle sows. So now we've even got a psychosomatic or a psychological impact potentially to the immune system. We have, in addition, you can take the things, any sort of toxic effect within the intestinal tract. We have 108 nerves from the vagal nerve system that actually go back to the brain and give us this stimulus. So anyway, this tells us we have a mechanism that goes to the brain that helps set up a lot of these pathways. Let's go back to something with the animal and the sow, trying to look at this model. This is data from Iowa State University, and if we take a look what they did, this is a subset of a very big project that they did looking at culling reasons for sows. But what intrigued me was they looked at the issue of what were the actual reproductive reasons that animals did get culled. What they found was acyclical ovaries was the #1 reproductive response that they found in this big group of sows. That intrigued me because probably 10 years ago we looked at a project and we couldn't find the fact that this was our major one. Our major one was cystic ovaries, probably at about a 15% rate. This one was their highest one. What was interesting, though, was the correlations that they found. This event was correlated with body condition scores and highly correlated with rear foot abscesses. So now we've got an inflammatory thing or an issue with these lame sows that increases the issue of actually acyclical ovaries. If we look at a pathway or try to think about a pathway that may give us an easier look at how did we get to this, we can take a look at things like our cytokine release, affects the brain, the GnRH release from the brain. We already know nutrition can do that. If we can undernutrition the sow, we can get a decrease in GnRH. We get a decrease in GnRH when we stimulate these cytokines. Now, it's not an all or none response. It's a graded response as to how much stress and impact did this inflammatory response from the feed actually give you. Decreases then, this decreases our pituitary response, LH and FSH. We find a decrease in steroidogenesis, and we will tend to see changes, particularly in the female, of oocyte quality, right? That oocyte that gets ovulated. We don't ovulate less generally unless it gets quite acute or severe. We will tend to ovulate the same, but the quality goes down. We have less pigs born, and we find this in scenarios where they can't find an actual disease or what we classified as our true diseases. But now with this, we've got a reason that pig numbers decreased for that production. You want to get more severe, and we get particularly the release and levels of interleukin-1, TNF-alpha. And what is interesting on these different cytokines, they release at different cascades of time frame. It's important the speed when they come out. TNF-alpha is the first one released. It's in there the least amount of time. It tries to clear from the blood system very quickly. If we take a look at IL-1, it usually tends to be the second one that's released. And so as we look at these, it isn't a simple cascade to understand what all these do. Now, if it's very severe, we can have a direct impact, particularly on the testes, particularly on the ovaries, that we will actually have a direct effect there, can increase our steroidogenesis, increases apoptosis of the follicular cell, and we have reasons for abortions. We have reasons for the issue of these cells actually being degraded down to that we go back to our acyclical ovaries, which are completely inactive and have shut down their hormonal conversation between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and the ovarian axis. All right? Now, severe inflammation, we see dramatic falls in sex steroids. This was particularly, we find this in burn patients, extreme inflammatory responses that almost the sexual steroids completely disappear. It means that ovary and the testes shut down. If we look at TNF-alpha, we can inhibit gonadal secretion just with a rise in TNF-alpha. If we find TNF-alpha in the semen, we tend to find that we have very poor sperm quality. Now, we don't always find it. We don't find it when we predictably would like to find it because there's a lot of other factors that can change that. Did we put in analgesics? Did we put in aspirin? Some of these types of products, and we don't see the release of the product, of the TNF-alpha. So IL-1 inhibits pulsatile secretion of GnRH. We're getting more and more evidence of the pathways that actually impact this. Reducing inflammatory responses and stress are very important. Growth and reproduction are physical processes that are intimately intertwined with the immune system. What is interesting, Dr. Kurt Klasing has recently put out an article in the poultry journals and talking about the nutrient itself has a big interplay and interaction with this whole process of the inflammatory response. If we can learn to manipulate and modulate immune barrier, inflammatory responses, the immune system, we may ultimately lead to better understanding of how to capture the genetic potential and efficiencies for food animal production. Not to maximize it, I don't think we can afford that, but to optimize it. I think that's our goal that we're actually targeted for and aiming for. Development of management, nutritional, pharmacological strategies to help reduce inflammatory responses due to lameness will allow more cost-effective pork production for our future. Thanks for your attention.